All right, welcome back everyone to the deep dive. This week we're going to be looking at, the disinformation landscape, kind of a snapshot of what happened last week. Last week on EU versus Disinfo report from March 17th to the 23rd, 2025. But the big focus today is going to be on the EEAS report, their third one, on foreign information manipulation and interference. All those acronyms we love so much, right? So FIMI. And that's really looking back at the big picture of 2024 and all the stuff that was going on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the ES report, it's our kind of core document for today's deep dive. It's amazing, just the sheer, I guess, how widespread and sophisticated, how much of this is going on in terms of foreign influence operations. So what we're going to do today is, try to kind of break it down, make it digestible, give you the key insights into, how these things work, who's behind them. And there's even a bit of a twist, I guess you could say. One of these adversary groups actually tried to use this report against Ukraine. So we'll be unpacking all that today.
Yeah, that's kind of wild. Using the report as a weapon, or trying to. But yeah, it's not just some fringe thing. It's a huge amount of data that they analyzed to come up with this overview of 2024.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, the EEAS, they looked at 505 separate, I guess, incidents of FIMI,
Well,
and that involved something like 38,000 different online channels across 25 different platforms. And, I mean, it's global, 90 countries targeted. And as you mentioned, Ukraine was really took the brunt of it. Almost half the incidents directed at them.
wow. 90 countries. That's really, really widespread. Yeah, Ukraine being the top target. I mean, sadly, with everything going on, that's not a huge surprise. But the report also introduces kind of a new way of thinking of all this data.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is, I think, a big step forward. They're calling it the FIMI exposure matrix. And it's you can kind of think about it as like giving you X-ray vision into these whole operations, so you can actually see who's connected, how they're amplifying each other's content, and ultimately kind of who might be behind the whole thing, pulling the strings. And this is huge because, we've been in this kind of whack-a-mole situation where, we're responding to individual bit of disinformation. But this gives us a way to think about potentially kind of dismantling these whole networks, these operations. It's about understanding the architecture of these digital campaigns, particularly those linked to Russia and China.
Okay, so that's a big deal. So I mean, we've talked about the sheer volume of this, but what were some of the key trends that the report highlighted about the FIMI landscape, throughout 2024?
So, well, we've already mentioned the global reach, those 90 countries, but beyond Ukraine, France, Germany, Moldova, and the Sahel region of Africa, those were also kind of hotspots for these operations. And I don't think it will be a surprise to anyone that elections were a major target for foreign interference. The report specifically mentions 42 attempts by Russia to meddle in the European elections. But, that's just one example. Taiwan, the U.S., Moldova, and Georgia, and the French elections were all kind of under attack, I guess you could say, from these actors.
Yeah. Sounds like no election is safe.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about, changing votes. Organizations like the EU and NATO were directly targeted. Independent media, they mentioned Le Parisien, the BBC, France 24, Der Spiegel, the Stampa. Those were all, victims of these attacks. And even the people working to expose disinformation. So groups like Bellingcat, EUDisinfo Lab, Corrective, they became targets themselves. And sadly, EU heads of state and government officials weren't immune either.
So, I mean, this is like a full-on assault on open information, on democracy, on institutions. What about the actual spaces online where this is happening? Were there any platforms, any trends there?
Oh, yeah, for sure. There are some really, really clear patterns that emerged. X, formerly Twitter, accounted for a whopping 88% of the FIMI activity analyzed by the EEAS. Facebook was significant as well, as were websites and Telegram. And in terms of how these actors actually work, their methods, what they call their tactics, techniques, and procedures, the report uses the acronym TTPs. We're seeing the continued use of bot networks. So that's a pretty familiar tactic. They also talk about coordinated inauthentic behavior, so CIB. And that's basically, think about it as groups of fake accounts, kind of like these online puppets, all controlled by the same people to push a particular message or agenda. So it's not just some random person trolling. It's an organized, coordinated effort. And then, of course, the impersonation of legitimate news websites, things like that doppelganger campaign. And increasingly, we're seeing the use of AI to create content.
Yeah, the AI, it's it's kind of scary, right? I mean, it makes it so easy and so fast to pump this stuff out. So the report kind of breaks things down into these actors, and let's start with Russia. I mean, what were the main takeaways there?
Well, the report really underscores that Russia sees information confrontation as a central part of their doctrine. It's a key part of their geopolitical strategy. They view the information space, as an actual battleground. So this isn't just about, manipulating things in the short term. They're playing a long game, trying to shape global narratives to favor their interests. And they're very good at finding and exploiting local vulnerabilities to amplify their messages. We saw this really clearly with Moldova in their attempts to interfere with the elections in the EU accession referendum.
Right, and this isn't just external efforts. There's a strong element of control within Russia itself.
Oh, absolutely. Censorship within Russia is widespread, and they heavily fund state-controlled media outlets like RT and Sputnik, which are key players in this. The report also highlights how Russia integrates its diplomatic efforts with these FIMI campaigns. So they're using international platforms, embassy social media, to try to legitimize their disinformation efforts. And their narratives tend to focus on, undermining support for Ukraine, pushing back against sanctions, stirring nationalist sentiments, and also trying to cast doubt on the effectiveness of Western defenses.
So they're playing all the angles. So what about China? How does their approach to FIMI compare to Russia's, according to the report?
So China's activities, while also very significant, do have some unique characteristics. In 2024, they were really focused on the Taiwanese and U.S. presidential elections. They're also, they're very actively working to expand the global reach of their state-controlled media. And something we're seeing more and more of is their use of these private PR companies and influencers to create and spread their content. The Paperwall, Hanergy, and Via Network campaigns are good examples of that.
So they're kind of maybe outsourcing some of it in a way, as opposed to the more direct approach that Russia seems to take in some areas.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And China continues to use information suppression, as a key tactic. Their narratives tend to focus on, defending their international image, especially when it comes to issues like human rights and the South China Sea. They want to project this, positive image of China's role in the world. And, of course, they're very critical of the West. The report did point out some interesting instances where Chinese and Russian narratives kind of overlap, almost opportunistically aligning, for example, on the idea that NATO is ultimately to blame for the conflict in Ukraine.
So they might not always be working together, but when it's convenient, yeah. So let's go back to this FIMI exposure matrix, because this is new this year. How does it actually work in practice? How does it help us analyze these threats?
So the matrix is basically a framework for classifying these online channels based on how closely they're tied to state actors. It's about how much evidence is there of a connection. So there are four main categories. First, you have the official state channels. So those are, government websites, official social media accounts, things that are overtly run by the state. Then you have state-controlled outlets like RT and Sputnik, where the funding and control by the state is pretty obvious. Then it gets a bit more murky. You have state-linked channels. So that's where the connection is maybe less obvious, but it can be established through, technical evidence, shared infrastructure, or even just looking at patterns of activity, seeing how they're coordinating their messaging. And finally, you have state-aligned channels. Those are ones that consistently promote a particular state's interests, but a clear, direct link hasn't been established yet. So you're going beyond just identifying official state media. You're mapping out this whole, ecosystem of potential influence where the connections might not be obvious at first glance. Exactly. And the matrix relies on both technical and behavioral indicators.
Right.
So, on the technical side, it could be things like shared website registration details, things like that. But behaviorally, it's looking for patterns, consistent messaging, coordinated amplification, things like that. And so by looking at all those factors together, you can start to classify these channels and, get closer to the goal of attribution, which is really key, figuring out who is actually behind these operations.
Yeah.
And then from there, you can start thinking about targeted responses.
Right. So it's like a detective's toolkit in a way.
In a way, yeah.
So the report uses this matrix to analyze the overall architecture of these FIMI operations that took place in 2024. I mean, what did that high-level view reveal?
Well, as we've been talking about, Russia and China really are the dominant actors in the FIMI space that they analyzed. And what's interesting is the differences in how they structure these operations. Russia seems to be more decentralized, adapting to different regional contexts. So it's not just Sputnik and RT, but also things like these, the fake news websites associated with Doppelganger and the African Initiative. Now, China, on the other hand, they're more centralized, more synchronized. They're state-controlled media, Global Times, CGTN. Those are major hubs. But they also, as we discussed, they utilize these influence for hire networks quite a bit.
So it's almost like Russia is a network of interconnected cells, and China is more like a centralized command structure, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful way to think about it. The analysis also pointed out different kinds of actors within these networks. So they talk about these high-influence hubs. They create a lot of content boosters that help to spread it widely, and then bridges that kind of connect different parts of the network across platforms and even geographically. They looked at how the content actually spreads. They use multiple platforms. There's a lot of adaptation to regional preferences in terms of, what platform is used. And then there's this whole concept of information laundering, which is, think about it like money laundering, right? You're trying to clean up dirty money. Well, disinformation can be laundered in a similar way by being passed through a series of seemingly independent channels to obscure its origin and make it seem more credible. And they observed instances where Russia and China were amplifying each other's anti-Western messaging, which is, that's pretty significant. They also saw some coordination between parts of the network that could be directly attributed to a state, and those where the links are a little less clear. So there's this kind of interplay between, the overt and covert aspects of these operations.
So it's a very intricate web. Now, the report dives into some specific case studies looking at Russia's activity in Moldova and Africa and China's what they call influence for hire operations. Let's start with Moldova. What did the EEAS findings highlight there?
So Moldova is a really clear example of how Russia seizes these key political moments. In this case, it was the presidential elections and the EU referendum to try to achieve these long-term goals. In Moldova, it's about undermining stability and preventing them from moving closer to the West. And they use this mix of overt channels, covert channels. They redeployed some of the disinformation infrastructure that they've been using against Ukraine, and even created new local channels, one called Moldova 24, to push their narratives.
So what exactly were the main messages that they were pushing in Moldova?
Well, a lot of it was focused on this idea that EU integration is a threat to Moldova, that it's a threat to their national identity, their sovereignty. They were also pushing a lot of false allegations of election fraud to try to delegitimize President Mia Sandu, and that we saw the recycling of some narratives that they've been using against Ukraine, like the whole organ trafficking conspiracy theory, which has been debunked thoroughly. And their tactics were pretty aggressive. They were using these AI-generated deepfakes of President Sandu, spreading fake documents, and even using this Telegram chatbot that was offering people money to share this anti-EU content.
So very much playing on those internal vulnerabilities and the political context within Moldova. So what about Russia's activities in Africa? The report also shed some light on that.
Yeah, Africa seems to be a major area of focus for Russia. They have a long-term, multi-layered strategy for the continent. They've been, increasing the presence of their state-controlled media, like Sputnik Afrique and RT. And we're seeing some evolution in their covert networks. What they're calling the African Initiative seems to have taken over some operations that were previously linked to the Wagner Group, which is interesting. The flow of information seems to be more decentralized in Africa and also more bidirectional. It's not just, Russia pushing content out, but also kind of pulling information and feedback from local sources. And they're forging stronger ties with local actors, these inauthentic news websites, social media influencers, really kind of building those connections on the ground.
Interesting. So what kind of narratives are they pushing in Africa?
Well, they tend to portray Western countries as, basically modern-day colonial powers. And Russia, of course, is presented as this reliable ally, this key partner, especially when it comes to counterterrorism. They're exploiting existing social and cultural divisions, trying to kind of stoke those flames, and then echoing what they're doing elsewhere. They're pushing the false narrative of Ukraine being a neo-Nazi state, and France seems to be a particular target of theirs in the region. They're constantly accusing France of fueling instability, and The report even mentions how they use offline events as well to spread these narratives. So it's not just online. It's really kind of this multi-pronged approach.
So really, really tailored to the specific context, the local grievances and historical context. Now, lastly, the report looks at China's influence for hire operations. This sounds particularly, I don't know, sneaky.
Yeah. So this is basically where these Chinese state-linked actors use online services, these private PR companies, to as a way to kind of do their dirty work, spread disinformation without leaving their fingerprints all over it. So they use these networks of inauthentic websites that are they're designed to look like real news outlets. It's meant to give the illusion of independent reporting, but in reality they're pushing state-backed propaganda. And companies like Shanghai Hasun Technology, Shenzhen Haimancheng Media, they've been linked to these operations, and they use these intermediary entities as well to provide content and kind of activate these website networks. Campaigns like Hainergy, Paperwall, VN Network, those are some of the examples that were highlighted in the report.
So it's a way for China to push its agenda without directly, using its state media, right? Like plausible deniability. It maybe allows them to reach audiences that would, normally be skeptical of overtly state-controlled sources.
Exactly. I mean, a lot of what these websites do is, they republish content directly from Chinese state media like Global Times and Xinhua. Sometimes they'll cite the source, but often they won't. And sometimes they'll have what looks like original content, but it always aligns with these key Chinese narratives. And the thing is, when you start looking at the technical side, things like shared website hosting and their behavior, it's very clear that these seemingly independent networks are actually linked back to these PR companies and ultimately to the Chinese state. And the goal seems to be, to influence those online search results, to try to shape online discussions over the long term.
So this has been a lot of information, a real deep dive, as we like to say, into this, very complex and frankly concerning world of FIMI. To wrap things up, what would you say is the single most important takeaway from this EES report for our listeners?
I think the key takeaway is that this report gives us this, really granular understanding of just how sophisticated and interconnected this world of foreign information manipulation and interference really is.
Yeah.
It shows us the threats, the very real threats that we face from actors like Russia and China, and just how extensive and hidden their digital arsenals really are. This new tool, the FIMI exposure matrix, gives us, I think, a really valuable way of analyzing these threats. So we're not just, playing whack-a-mole anymore, reacting to individual bits of disinformation. We can start to map out the bigger picture, look at the whole network, understand the architecture, and really start to get ahead of it.
And why should this information matter to our listeners, in their everyday lives? Why is this important?
Well, understanding these tactics, understanding the networks behind them, it's crucial for anyone navigating the modern information landscape. I mean, it's a minefield out there. And this knowledge empowers you to be, more discerning about the information that you're consuming and hopefully less susceptible to manipulation. I mean, the fact that these actors tried to misuse this report itself, shows how determined they are. So critical thinking is essential. Be informed, be aware of how these operations work, and you can be a more resilient target and, a more informed participant in democratic discourse.
Yeah. The more you know, the less likely you are to be, to fall prey to this kind of stuff. So as this digital world continues to evolve and these actors keep finding new ways to manipulate and exploit, what is one final thought that you would leave our listeners with?
I would say think about this. In a world where information is so easily manipulated and weaponized, how can we as individuals, as societies, how can we strengthen our collective resilience? What steps can you take to become a more critical consumer of information, a more informed citizen in this really complex and ever-changing environment? It's a question that's worth asking ourselves every day.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today for another deep dive. We'll be back next week with more analysis, more insights into the world of disinformation. Until then, stay vigilant.
Indeed.
All right. Take care, everyone.